We have Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is he calls himself a democratic socialist. He's really an out-of-the-closet, hardcore socialist when you look at his career. He hasn't done anything in the private sector that's been productive, but he's a multimillionaire.
That's right. And it's interesting. You're right. He describes himself and his policies are certainly hardcore socialist. If you look at his investment portfolio, this will surprise a lot of people. He's invested in Fortune 500 companies. He's not invested in renewable energy companies or socially responsible investment funds. And when you look at his public career since the 1980s as mayor of Burlington and then a congressman and then a senator and presidential candidate, it all revolves around bringing money into the family. So take back to Burlington, Vermont. He is the mayor. One of the first things he does, Mark, is he says, I'm going to hire my girlfriend and put her on the city payroll. Jane Sanders, who's now his wife, was put on the payroll. And you go back and look at the local press accounts and you realize the city council said, wait a minute. You're giving her a job that we didn't actually create, we haven't funded, and if this position were to exist, you never advertised it, you never gave other people the opportunity to take it or to apply for it, and Bernie just blew him off. So Jane had a paid job throughout his tenure. When he ran for Congress, he discovered a secret that a lot of Washington insiders know, Mark, which is you can make a lot of money doing media buys for political campaigns. So, for example, if you were a candidate for the United States Senate and you wanted to buy $1 million in advertising, and I did that purchase, I would get the $1 million, but the standard practice is I would get to keep about 15% as a commission. So you can make a lot of money doing media buys. So what does Bernie Sanders do? He's running for Congress in Vermont. He makes his wife, Jane, responsible for media buys. And we estimate based on the numbers.
So the family gets the 15%.
Absolutely. In fact, Mark, they set up an LLC, which they registered at their home in Vermont, and the owners were his wife, Jane Sanders, and their 2 children. So it's quite a cozy setup. So we estimate they probably made $150,000 off of that arrangement. But
he's quite the crony capitalist.
Yes, he's quite the crony capitalist. The big question mark that we don't know the answer to, but we have suspicions, comes with the 2016 presidential race. We're not talking about small media buys now. We're talking about his campaign spending $83 million on media buys, which means the commission is somewhere around $12 million. So who did the $83 million? Where did that $83 million flow? It went through this company called Old Town Media. Now, you look up Old Town Media, it has no website, it has no footprint. It's registered to a suburban Virginia home on a cul-de-sac. Then you find out who owns this entity. It happens to be 2 individuals who worked with Jane Sanders doing media buys when Bernie was running for Congress. Now, Jane was asked about this by a progressive reporter, actually, from Vermont during the 2016 election. What did she know about Old Town Media? Did she have any involvement in it? According to the reporter, she hung up the phone. So the question is, where did that money go? It certainly fits the pattern that we've seen with Bernie Sanders, who for decades, for about 36 years by our account, used the phrase, our politics should not be dominated by billionaires and millionaires. About 3 years ago, he dropped the reference to millionaires because he's now won. And I think the big surprise that a lot of supporters will find is this is an individual who talks about socialism, certainly has not conducted himself, his investments, and his family life, not being interested in material
You know what, Peter,
things.
that's typical of oligarchs in Russia, in these other totalitarian regimes, whether they're communist or fascist or whatever it is. It's one thing for the people,
Right,
but it's another thing for them. So this is an area that the media and Bernie Sanders' opponents should really pursue. Try and nail it down.
Yeah, absolutely, it should. And, you know, the other thing that comes through in all this, Mark, is if you look in the Vermont press and a lot of the interviews, I mean, Bernie Sanders does not dislike or hate all rich people. He only dislikes and hates rich people who are opposed to his agenda. So you find that there are very prominent wealthy people in Vermont who have vested interests, who he goes to bat for all the time. at the expense of local people. For example, there's a gentleman who is creating these large-scale industrial wind farms, where they put these big windmills, dozens of them, and people that live
They're
around.
appalling.
Yeah, exactly. And if you live next door to it, suddenly you've got these huge windmills all around you. Those landowners sue, trying to stop him from building these. Which side does Bernie come down on? On the side of Mr. Blittersdorf, who's doing this. Why? Because Blittersdorf backs him and is supportive of his campaigns.
Fascinating, fascinating.